In this episode, I'm going to just share my impressions of the Aputure Nova P600C. So first up, this is not really a review. It's not a consumer electronics product. It is a professional grade lighting instrument for video and film. And I want to share just some of my impressions as an education and corporate video professional. I think the first question we really need to address is who this light is for. And I would say that this light is really for rental houses, for production companies, for gaffers, and if you're, for example, a freelance gaffer, or perhaps for a studio. So I would say the average YouTuber, this is probably not the light for them, although they certainly could use it if they had a bigger budget to work with. But I think it's really aimed at that group of professionals that are doing professional lighting designs for video and film. So I had a conversation with Ted Sim, who is the lead over at Aputure Lighting. This is several years ago, probably 2017, 2018, somewhere in that time frame. And one of my questions to him, we were having dinner, and I asked him, what's your goal with Aputure? Where are you headed with this? And at the time, he told me, and again, I think it was 2017, he told me, I'd like to see our lights on production trucks. And, at the time I was like, because this is about the time, I think the COB lights, the single point lights were out, the initial batch of them at least. So this was the C120 Mark II, I think, was pretty new at that point. I don't know if the C300 Mark II had been announced yet, but it was pretty, so earlier on in Aputure's life, I guess. And so I was a little bit skeptical, but I think that time has come now with tools like the P600C. Now, let me just talk about some of the features that are unique. There are, obviously, I've reviewed a lot of Aputure lights, and I've always been impressed. The color quality that comes out of these lights is actually surprisingly good. In fact, back to the LS1 days, that was their first LED panel. That panel had some of the best color quality at that point. And that's when LEDs were just starting to hit the market and starting to become more serious tools for... there were some at the very high end, but they were very, very expensive. But even back then, Aputure was doing a good job on color quality. That's no difference here. We'll go ahead and put some of the color metrics up on the screen here so you can see how this one does, but it does really, really well. That's not the unique feature of this. What is unique about this, first of all, it is an RGBWW light, so also that's not that unique. But what is unique about this one is it does have a removable diffusion panel. So if you do need just a little bit more punch through maybe a 4x4, a silk or something like that, or you're doing maybe a book light setup or something like that, maybe a cove light, you can get a little bit more punch out of it. And this light already produces more light for its size and sort of kind of in its class than other lights. So it's already it's got a step ahead. Its actual face is a little bit smaller, so it's not truly 2x1, but in terms of light output, it's definitely punching above that a little bit. You can tune it from 2,000 to 10,000 Kelvin in terms of color temperature, and it does also have a green-magenta balance. Now, the green-magenta balance is an interesting one. That is a feature that I really appreciate, and I think it's really important when you're working with a lot of different lights to be able to match them. So, and there's another consideration as well, that LEDs change in terms of their green-magenta balance over time. So as they get more hours on them, they turn a little bit more green. So being able to adjust that is really helpful for those situations where you're doing color critical work. We could go on and on and on about how much output this is. Again, here are the color metrics and the photometrics so you can see the output. It puts out plenty of light. It also does another thing that's kind of interesting. It's actually the first light that I've seen this feature on. It does have an ability to change the frequency. So LED lights, generally when you dim them, They do that via a variety of different techniques, and one of the techniques is the pulse width modulation. So technically, when you dim them down, what they're doing is very, very fast. They're turning on and off instead of actually dimming in the kind of the intuitive sense of dimming. So they're using techniques like that. Now, the problem with that is that if you're doing high-speed filming, that can create problems. You can start to get a flicker effect. And so in this case, you can actually tune that speed between 20 kilohertz and 22 kilohertz. So if you are finding you're getting some flicker, you can always tune the light a little bit in terms of its frequency, and that could potentially solve that flicker issue. Now, there are a variety of different modes to control the color output. And probably for traditional filming, you're going to use the CCT mode the most, obviously. Correlated color temperature. So that's going to be able to be tuned from 2000 Kelvin all the way up to 10,000 Kelvin. So you should be able to match almost any other light source that you're working in, which is really helpful. And actually, you can use that as an effect light in a lot of ways. Once you get up to 10,000 Kelvin, for example, that turns very, very blue. So if you do need to punch it that way, you can do that. Of course, there are other modes you can use to use it as more of an RGB or an effects light. And of course, there is the HSI mode, hue, saturation, intensity mode. So that's a really good way to work if you're used to working with a color wheel. You just dial in the hue on the color wheel that you want. You can choose how saturated you want that color to be, and then the intensity is basically like the dimmer. So that's a pretty intuitive way where I typically like to work if I'm doing color effects. But if you prefer RGB mode and you want to mix in RGB colors, that's a way you can work as well. There's also an XY mode. So if you prefer to work that way, that is a great mode or a great option as well. Now, one of the challenges I think with lights, not just panel lights, but all lights, is that sometimes once you put a modifier on the front of it, that yoke can kind of get in the way. So they've made this curved yoke design, which makes it a little easier to put things like soft boxes on the light and not have any problems in terms of being able to aim it down. Especially down is usually the issue with a lot of lights. Not an issue here. It's a big light. It weighs quite a bit. So the head on its own is 30.29 pounds, 13.75 kilograms. And so with that comes a couple of different things. First of all, it has a dual tilt lock system. So you've got these really great quality handbrake type locking mechanisms on both sides. So you can support big modifiers if you need to do that. So that's great. And then on the yoke, it uses a junior pin. So you are not going to use this on a C-stand. This is a light that's a little bit too heavy for a C-stand, so you're really going to need a junior stand with a junior receiver on it. Now, from the P300C, so they're smaller light in the same line, they've upgraded the control box. So the control box is a separate unit. You can actually attach it to the light on the back, or you can tether it and use a cable that runs 3 meters. It gives you a little bit of extra space. So especially if you're flying the light up high, you've still got access to the controls on the control box. And we'll talk about some other remote control options in just a moment. But the nice thing is if you do choose to mount it on the back of the light itself, it's got pins that it connects to, so you don't need to use a cable when it's connected to the back of the box, which is a nice little feature as well, just to keep a kind of cleaner setup and one less cable to worry about. In terms of power, there is no separate ballast or separate power supply. It is all built into the head itself, which is very convenient. And even so, even with that, it's still lighter than some of the competition. So if you're looking at some of the Airy Sky panels, for example, this still comes in a little bit lighter. And so that makes it convenient. So I'm not too worried. Sometimes the integrated power supplies can be worrisome if it makes the head a lot heavier because, again, if you're going to be flying that up higher, that requires a more substantial stand and you have to be a little bit more careful. In this case, it's not a concern. Now, it comes with a Neutrik PowerCon cable and a connector. So obviously, if you're running that to AC power, you can do that. If you are going to run it off batteries, however, there is a 3-pin XLR input, and that takes 48 volt up to 15 amps. Yeah, 48 volt, 15 amps. So for example, with the Aputure little battery station, you can run it off of 2 Cine batteries with enough, if you've got enough amperage there, and that can power it if you're out in some remote location. So if you don't have a generator, or you prefer not to use a generator, and the sound people thank you if you don't, that's another way to power this. Of course, you better have some batteries on hand. This is a 720 watt in terms of its consumption at max power, so that's something I'll have to take into consideration. It can move through those cine batteries pretty quickly. Now, there are a variety of different modes where you can remotely control the light. And I think one thing is that's very interesting is, well, first of all, there's DMX. So if you have, it has a DMX in and out, 5-pin, it is 16-bit capable. And so if you do have a grid and you're in a studio and you're working with a DMX system that's a traditional wired system, this can do all of that. It has a whole bunch of different profiles for different DMX configurations. So you're pretty well covered there if that's your particular use case. But it also does support Lumenradio. So that's a really nice thing as well. So again, basically wireless DMX is what that can do. And then it also supports the Aputure-specific Sidus Link, which they have built into all of the lights that they've produced in the last, I want to say 3 years or so, maybe 3.5, 4 years almost. And Sidus Link is probably the best mobile app I've seen for controlling LED light systems out there. It is incredibly powerful. You can do so much with it, and it reconnects quickly. That's one of the things that I hate about a lot of those systems is that you can only connect to one light at a time on some of the more consumer-oriented ones. And even if they do control multiple lights, sometimes the reconnection process takes a long time. This actually creates a Bluetooth mesh network. So if you were working with a bunch of Aputure lights, they essentially create a mesh network on set to communicate with each other. And so you don't really have a lot of dead spots, which is oftentimes a concern with Bluetooth. The range isn't that great on Bluetooth, but once they all start communicating with each other on their mesh network, it makes it seamless. So I've never had an issue with that. Now, if you're just doing a really simple setup, there is also a lead follow mode. So you can essentially set one of the lights as a leader and the other lights to followers, and they will do what you set on the primary light. So that's a really pretty convenient thing if you just need to do a really quick setup and you don't have time to, work with apps of various sorts or whatever the case may be. So it just makes it a lot easier to quickly do something. One thing that's pretty interesting about this light is that there are 4 separate what they call light engines. So you can control these individual light engines separately, either on the control box or via app. That's pretty interesting. At first I thought, well, what's the point of that? Why does that matter? There are a couple of effects that you can do, color chases and things like that. So that can be a legitimate thing, of course. But the thing that's more interesting to me is that things like the fire effect are a little bit more convincing when it has the 4 different zones to create that effect, as opposed to just a single light, just basically changing colors and flickering. So this is a little bit more convincing. So it's kind of interesting what they can do now that they have those separate engines. Now, in that same vein, there are 19 different effects and over 300 different gels available in the unit itself. It is firmware updatable, so that could be changed and additional could be added as well. So just a lot of flexibility there as well. Now, right here, I'm just shooting through a 4x4 with a silk on it. So, of course, you could do something very simple like that, but there are also a variety of different modifiers that are and will become available in the next little bit here. So, of course, there's all the DOP choice, but also Aputure has some of their own, also some Chimera products. They will have their own softbox, barn doors, a space light, honeycomb grids, intensifier panel, dual panel frame, a studio yoke, and a rain cover as well. So some things that they're going to put out in specific for this light that will make things a little bit easier on set or location. In terms of pricing, comes in at $3,290 US for the light without a case, or $3,590 US if you do get it with the rolling Pelican style case as well. So a few considerations for those that have not worked with a light like this before. You get a ton of light output. Right now it's at 30%. The 4x4 is probably 1.5 meters from me over here. And then the light is another 0.5 meters behind that. Just to give you a sense at a very practical level, we're shooting at ISO 800 f4, 180 degree shutter angle on 23.976 frame rate. So just to give you a sense for the practical exposure setting that we're using here. This light is a little bit, for those that haven't worked with one of these panel lights before, it's heavy. It's 30, as I mentioned before, 30.29 pounds, 13.74 kilograms. And, again, you're not working with C stands at this point. You're working with junior stands. So a little bit more, a little heftier, a little heavier. So it's not your consumer grade plastic LED light that you can just move around with one hand and just put it wherever you want. It's going to take a little bit more work, and you have to do some rigging. So just something to be aware of. Of course, the benefit is that you get an amazing amount of light output. You get all of these other features that we've covered here as well. So really what I'm just talking about here is what's the difference between a $400, maybe $600 LED light versus something like this that costs over $3,000. And hopefully, as we've kind of talked through some of these features here, you start to see the distinctions. So overall, those are my impressions. The Aputure P600C, an amazing light. I would just say for those that are tempted to leave a comment that says, this is way too expensive, I would never spend this much money on a light, you have to consider what the competitors are to this light. The competitors are generally at least this expensive and mostly a lot more expensive than this. I mean, if you look at the Airy Sky panels, go look those up, and you'll see there's quite a difference in price. So it's really interesting to see Aputure start to compete in that space. So I hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. If you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that, and we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.